Guilty on 4 counts.
Yeah.
Rivonia Trial. What were you feeling? You knew, did you have a
No,
sense
I
that was coming?
expected, well, we expected their sentences. And you see, everybody was worried about Nelson and Walter getting a death sentence. But I knew in quotation marks, I felt very strongly that if they were executed, there would be an uprising. If Denis Goldberg, the white traitor to the white people, was executed, my comrades would mourn me, but there wouldn't have been an uprising. And the whites in general and supporters of apartheid would have rejoiced. Because the attitude was, a man like Mandela couldn't do anything without a guy like Goldberg around, you know, which is nonsense, absolute nonsense. It was my honor to serve him and other great leaders. As a leader myself, I would have to say, but here and there, up there, you know. And so when the judge found us guilty on 4 counts, the next day, 12th of June 1964, he comes in and he reads from a little slip of paper, just so big. In a trial tantamount to one of high treason, the appropriate sentence is the ultimate sentence, meaning death. And then he says, but. Good word, but. Little, because he's obviously not going to sentence us to death. And then he says, but in accordance with his duty to uphold the law, the only leniency he can allow is life sentences on all 4 counts. And we laughed. The morning of the final day of sentence, Raymond Mhlaba comes to me. And he had a different story, as I'll so later discovered. He said, Comrade Denis, if there are death sentences, we shall not appeal. I said, oh, that's interesting. Cold, calm, that's interesting. Why? And he said, because we must let them hang us, get us out the way, our comrades will rise up and sweep apartheid away. And I said, interesting theory, but I think we should do everything to keep you alive, you and the others. It's taken 30 years to make you the leaders you are. We're going to need you to rebuild our country. Oh, thank you, comrade, he says. But he was still not convinced by my argument. When he was on his deathbed, just a few years ago, my wife and I drove up to see him. And I said, Comrade Ray, do you remember that conversation? He said, yes. And we laugh about it. He says, we didn't have to put it to the test, so we will never know who was right or wrong. But a cold-blooded political discussion about whether we should let ourselves be hanged. I said, governments aren't stupid. They will wait, they'll do us one at a time, you know, and see what happens.
You touched on it earlier on in a way that it was a trial of the century, it was a court drama, but in many ways it was more than that. It was a test of the legitimacy of the movement.
Absolutely, and what was interesting was that really the prosecutor, Utah, he tried to try us as a show trial to show we were utter terrorists. And he would time it so that he got a big fat headline at the end of each day. Goldberg's planning to make 140,000 hand grenades and so many landmines and so on, you see. For example, they had enough stuff they were planning to blow up the whole of Joburg. It was nonsense, but then came the defense, and I think the government miscalculated because the media were covering the trial in detail every day. That speech of Mandela's, 4 hours long. All my life I fought against white domination, I fought against black domination. my ideal is a society where we can live together in peace and harmony, more or less. And it's an ideal I hope to live to see achieved, but if needs be, my Lord, it's an ideal for which I'm prepared to die. It becomes a world-famous speech. He didn't shout it, he didn't scream it. You can hear in the recordings now how passionate he is. There's strain in his voice. But it's a very passionate feel. And I can tell you, we all knew what he was going to say. But at that moment, I realized he was saying to the judge, hang me if you dare to. Hang Walter, hang Dennis, hang Govan, hang Kathy, hang. And what a moment of pride. But Nelson had this ability to find the dramatic words. I don't know where he got it from. But what a speech, and then you see there was the Ron Daily Mail with the editor, I can't remember his name.
Not Anthony Sampson?
But he carried front page editorial articles from time to time during the trial. And he said, when we hear the evidence of these people like Mandela, Sisulu and others, people so passionate, so concerned about people, so wanting a peaceful society, what is it we in apartheid South Africa are doing wrong? This was remarkable stuff. Eventually the Harry Oppenheimer company fired him because he was losing circulation, because he was supporting the struggle against apartheid. But in addition to that, day by day, the mass of black South Africans were reading about what Congress was planning to do. Now, we couldn't produce 1 million leaflets a day. They were doing it for us. Seriously. I think this was a turning point, not just because of what the historians are saying. It actually changed the way people thought about it. And what did we do? We tried to add to our political struggle this element of armed struggle to control arbitrary violence. We would take on the armed forces of the state, the symbols of the state, of apartheid and so on, but we would not commit acts of terrorism because that creates a backlash that we could never have withstood. And so I think our people en masse understood the complexity of the struggle. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white together. In effect, our people were saying, we fight white supremacy, not whites because they're white. It's a very sophisticated distinction. And the mass of people followed it, because in the end there was the United Democratic Front with nearly 2 million members that supported ANC policies. They adopted the Freedom Charter, for example. So our people are intelligent, you know, uneducated, but intelligent, understanding the complexity. And that trial was Nelson actually, in effect, repeating the words of the Freedom Charter. South Africa belongs to all. I believe in all people living together. It's the same idea. And years later, he comes out of prison, he's still holding on to it. Man of principle. We were principled. And in addition, the Umkhonto Manifesto from December 1961, in effect says to the apartheid government, we will show you we can take power, we can build the military strength, it'll take time, but we can do it. But better to negotiate peacefully. When you're ready, we will negotiate. 30 years later, they're ready to negotiate. As people of principle, we say yes. Nelson in prison, our Tambo outside. The negotiations are taking place simultaneously.
How did you end up in Pretoria Central when others ended up in Robben Island? And it must have been very difficult for you too, because Robben Island's Cape Town. You'll feel something, whereas Pretoria Central is far from home.
Well, I'm in Mlungu. I'm white. There's apartheid. I was in a prison for white political prisoners. And For 5 years we slept on the floor on thin mats, windows, no glass. It gets cold in the winter, freezing cold. And when we made a way of closing up, they said, if you needed glass in the windows, the department would provide it. Take it out, freeze. I have to say, those are bad years. But then they built a special prison for white political prisoners. And I must say, physically, it was comfortable. There was a bed, but the mats on the bed. But hot and cold running water, flush toilets instead of buckets.
It must have been very difficult, because I read somewhere about how, particularly for you and Elias Motsoaledi, that were very affected by not being with your family. There was a sense by some of your comrades or people working together, these are difficult times, but we're not very much. How was that particular, your family, that separation? You had earlier on mentioned that you made the commitment to the struggle.
My wife was a political activist, and she was a comrade and a friend and a lover and a wife and mother of my children, all of it rolled up in one. I have to say, sexy as hell. It was very nice to have that all in one. But went into exile when I asked her to, because I escaped once from prison, and from Vereniging, a low security prison. They thought they could manipulate me better under interrogation if I was on my own. Well, I managed to escape, but got recaptured. Just got some broken ribs out of it and wore leg irons for a month and so on. But my clothes were bloodied. I'd gone through a barbed wire fence, scratched myself, and so my wife was allowed to see me to prove that I was still alive. And I said she must go, because later, well, Bram had told me that I must escape again, and they would have a car waiting for me. And what a slap in the face for the government that would be. And I couldn't tell my wife why she had to go, because she'd been detained. I escaped, they detained her and gave her a very bad time. Like all the women, the threat was, we're going to take your children, we will separate them in separate orphanages, they will never see each other or you again. That's a terrible threat to make. And so I wanted her out of the way if I would escape again. So she went to England, felt that she was betraying me by going while I'm on trial for my life. But she went, and it's very lonely, prison. There's nothing soft about prison, you know. And then, what was it, 1 letter in 6 months for 2 years, 1 visit in 6 months. At the time when you most want contact to know your family's okay, letters were supposed to be approximately 500 words. They would count the words and cut the letter to length. And the part they removed was always the part which said, I love you, which was the only part you wanted to read anyway. But in the end, you know, you either submit or you remain strong enough to not be broken. I think it took us 15 years to teach them to respect us with a proper greeting and a good morning, and they tried very hard to break us in all sorts of ways. You know, a prison officer can close a prison grill and then steel door, or you can slam it and turn the key that it goes through your head that you can't bear it.